The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked toward the massive hangar. Inside, a team of 12 engineers surrounded what remained of a crashed helicopter. The aircraft sat broken and twisted, its rotor blades bent at unnatural angles, the cockpit crushed inward like a giant fist had squeezed it. 3 weeks had passed since the crash. The helicopter had gone down during a routine training mission, carrying 4 crew members who barely survived with their lives. Now the engineers faced an impossible task: bring this machine back to life when everyone said it couldn't be done. Sarah had been assigned to oversee the project. At 32, she was one of the youngest captains in the engineering corps, but her reputation for solving complex problems had earned her this challenging assignment. She walked around the helicopter, noting every dent, every broken component, every twisted piece of metal. "What's the assessment?" she asked Chief Engineer Tom Bradley, a man who had spent 20 years working on military aircraft. Tom wiped his hands on a greasy rag and shook his head. "It's bad, Captain, really bad. The main rotor assembly is completely destroyed. The transmission took a massive hit. The engine block has stress fractures we can't even see yet. And that's just what we know about." Sarah nodded, studying the damage report spread across a nearby table. The helicopter was a CH-47 Chinook, a twin-rotor heavy-lift aircraft that cost millions of dollars to replace. More importantly, the military needed every helicopter they could get for upcoming operations overseas. "The brass wants this bird flying again," Sarah said. "What do you think our chances are?" Tom exchanged glances with the other engineers. "Honestly, I'd say close to 0. We'd need parts that aren't made anymore. Some of this damage goes right to the aircraft's structural integrity. Even if we could fix it, I'm not sure it would ever be safe to fly again." The team had already spent 2 weeks just assessing the damage. They had pulled apart systems, cataloged broken parts, and run diagnostic tests on everything they could reach. The more they learned, the more hopeless the situation seemed. Dr. Rebecca Chun, the team systems specialist, pulled up a holographic display of the helicopter's internal structure. Red zones marked areas of critical damage throughout the aircraft. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the display. The crash didn't just break individual components. It created a cascade failure throughout multiple systems. The impact force traveled through the entire airframe. Sarah studied the display carefully. She had worked on damaged aircraft before, but nothing this severe. The helicopter looked like it had fallen from a great height and hit the ground at full speed, which, according to the accident report, was exactly what had happened. The accident had occurred during what should have been a routine training flight. The crew was practicing low-altitude maneuvers when the helicopter suddenly lost power. The pilot, Major David Rodriguez, had only seconds to react. He managed to auto-rotate the aircraft down, using the unpowered rotors to slow their descent, but the landing was still devastating. All 4 crew members survived, though 2 spent weeks in the hospital. Major Rodriguez himself had suffered a broken leg and several cracked ribs. The co-pilot had a severe concussion. Despite their injuries, they considered themselves lucky to be alive. Now the engineers faced the challenge of giving new life to the machine that had nearly killed its crew. Sarah knew the importance of the project extended beyond just saving money on a replacement helicopter. Success here would prove that seemingly impossible repairs could be accomplished with enough skill and determination. "Let's start with what we can fix," Sarah decided. "Tom, I want your team to focus on the secondary systems first. Navigation, communications, hydraulics. Rebecca, you work on the electrical systems. If we can get those working, we'll have a better picture of the overall damage." The engineers spread out across the hangar floor, each taking responsibility for different aspects of the repair. The work was tedious and often frustrating. Parts that looked intact from the outside turned out to be damaged internally. Systems that should have been simple to repair revealed hidden problems that required hours of additional work. As the days passed, small victories began to accumulate. The communication system came back online after Tom's team replaced dozens of damaged wires and circuit boards. The navigation computers started functioning again once Rebecca installed new processors and rewired the main data bus. But for every system they repaired, 3 more revealed critical damage. The helicopter's main transmission, which transferred power from the engines to the rotors, was cracked in multiple places. The hydraulic systems that controlled the aircraft's movement had been contaminated with debris from the crash. Most seriously, stress fractures ran through key structural beams that held the entire aircraft together. Sarah found herself working longer hours each day, arriving at the hangar before dawn and staying until well after sunset. She studied technical manuals, consulted with specialists from other bases, and even contacted civilian helicopter repair facilities for advice. Nothing seemed to provide the breakthrough they needed. 2 more weeks passed. The engineers made progress on smaller repairs, but the major structural and mechanical issues remained unsolved. Replacement parts for some components simply didn't exist anymore. The helicopter model was older, and the military had moved on to newer designs. Manufacturing tooling for critical parts had been dismantled years ago. General Harrison visited the hangar on a Thursday afternoon. He walked slowly around the helicopter, asking detailed questions about the repair progress. Sarah provided honest answers about both their achievements and their ongoing challenges. "Captain Mitchell," the general said finally, "I understand your team has made significant progress on secondary systems." "Yes, sir, but the primary flight systems remain problematic. We're facing challenges that may be insurmountable with current resources and expertise," the general nodded thoughtfully. He had spent 40 years in the military and understood the realities of complex repair projects. Sometimes dedication and hard work weren't enough. Sometimes you needed something more. "I may have an idea," he said quietly. "Let me make some phone calls." Sarah watched the general leave, wondering what he had in mind. Her team continued their work, but she could see the frustration building. They were skilled engineers, among the best in the military, but this project was testing the limits of their abilities. The helicopter seemed determined to keep its secrets, resisting every attempt to bring it back to life. Friday morning brought a heavy rainstorm that drummed against the hangar roof like machine gun fire. Sarah arrived at her usual early hour to find the engineering team already gathered around their workstations. But something felt different. The energy in the room had shifted from determined optimism to quiet frustration. Tom Bradley approached her with a thick folder of test results. "Captain, we've run every diagnostic we can think of on the main rotor assembly. The damage is worse than we initially thought. The rotor head has microfractures throughout the entire hub. Even if we could somehow repair it, the metal fatigue would make it unsafe for flight operations." Sarah took the folder and flipped through pages of technical diagrams and stress analysis reports. Red markers highlighted failure points throughout the critical components. The numbers told a story of metal pushed beyond its breaking point, of structural integrity compromised at the molecular level. Dr. Chun joined them, carrying her tablet with the latest computer simulations. "I've been running virtual stress tests all night," she said. Even with perfect repairs to all other systems, the rotor assembly would fail catastrophically within 50 flight hours. "We're not just talking about an expensive repair anymore. We're talking about a death trap." The implications hit Sarah immediately. Military regulations required absolute safety margins for aircraft repairs. They couldn't put crew members at risk just to save money on a replacement helicopter. If the computer models showed potential failure, they would have to recommend scrapping the entire project. Sarah called the team together for a meeting. 12 engineers gathered around the conference table, their faces showing weeks of accumulated stress and disappointment. These were people who had dedicated their careers to solving impossible problems, but this helicopter seemed to have defeated them. "I want honest assessments from everyone," Sarah began. "Where do we stand with our individual systems?" One by one, the engineers reported their findings. The electrical systems were nearly complete, with only minor issues remaining. The hydraulic systems could be repaired, though it would require custom manufacturing of several components. The communications and navigation equipment was functioning perfectly, but when they reached the critical flight systems, The reports grew increasingly grim. The engine showed internal damage that would require a complete rebuild. The transmission had stress fractures that couldn't be welded safely. The flight control mechanisms were damaged beyond repair. Even if we had unlimited resources in 6 months, Tom concluded, I'm not sure we could make this aircraft airworthy again. The crash damage was too extensive. Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. She would have to write a report recommending that the project be terminated. All their weeks of work would be documented as a learning experience, but the helicopter would end up in a scrapyard. That afternoon, General Harrison returned to the hangar. He arrived during a brief break in the rainstorm, his uniform damp from the walk across the airfield. Sarah briefed him on the team's findings, providing detailed technical explanations for why the repair project had reached an impasse. So you're telling me that 12 of our best engineers can't fix one helicopter? The general asked. Sir, it's not a matter of skill or determination. The damage is simply too extensive for conventional repair methods. Some problems can't be solved with current technology and available resources. General Harrison walked slowly around the helicopter again, stopping to examine specific areas of damage. He had flown helicopters himself early in his career, before advancing through the ranks to his current position. He understood aircraft mechanics at a practical level that complemented his administrative responsibilities. Captain, let me ask you something, he said finally. How old do you think this helicopter is? Sarah checked her records. According to the maintenance logs, it was manufactured in 1987, so it's been in service for about 36 years. And in those 36 years, how many people do you think have worked on this specific aircraft? Sarah considered the question. Military helicopters received maintenance from hundreds of different technicians over their service lives. Pilots, crew chiefs, mechanics, engineers, thousands of hands had touched this machine during its decades of operation. Probably hundreds of people, sir. Maybe thousands? That's right. And most of those people learned their skills working on aircraft exactly like this one. But here's what I'm thinking. What if we could find someone who didn't just work on this type of helicopter, but who helped design it in the first place? The idea intrigued Sarah. Original design engineers would have intimate knowledge of the aircraft's construction, understanding not just how it worked, but why it was built that way. They would know the manufacturing tolerances, the stress distribution patterns, the critical failure points that might not be obvious to later technicians. Sir, are you thinking of contacting the original manufacturer? General Harrison smiled. I'm thinking of something better than that. Captain, how much do you know about the development history of the CH-47 Chinook? Sarah admitted her knowledge was limited to operational specifications and maintenance procedures. She knew the helicopter's capabilities and performance characteristics, but not much about its design origins. The Chinook was developed in the early 1960s, General Harrison explained. It was revolutionary for its time, a tandem rotor design that could lift heavy loads and operate in challenging conditions. The engineers who worked on that project were brilliant innovators who solved problems nobody had ever faced before. The general paused, looking at the damaged helicopter with what seemed like recognition. One of those engineers was a young man named Frank Morrison. He worked on the original rotor dynamic systems and transmission design. After the war, he continued working on helicopter improvements for another 20 years before retiring. Sarah began to understand where the conversation was heading. Do you know how to contact this Frank Morrison, sir? I might, General Harrison said. Frank Morrison isn't just any retired engineer. He's my father-in-law. And if anyone can figure out how to fix this helicopter, it's him. The revelation surprised Sarah. She had expected the general to suggest consulting with corporate engineers or academic specialists. Instead, he was proposing to bring in a family member who had worked on the original design decades earlier. Sir, with respect, wouldn't a current engineer be more familiar with modern repair techniques? Captain, modern repair techniques are exactly what have failed you so far. This helicopter was built using 1960s engineering principles and 1980s manufacturing methods. Sometimes you need someone who understands the original thinking behind the design. General Harrison checked his watch. Frank is 84 years old now, but his mind is still sharp as a razor. He spends his retirement building model aircraft and consulting on aviation history projects. I think he might enjoy the challenge of solving a problem that has stumped 12 modern engineers. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and skepticism. Could an elderly retired engineer really provide insights that her highly trained team had missed? On the other hand, they had exhausted conventional approaches without success. Perhaps an unconventional solution required unconventional expertise. What would you like me to do, sir? I'm going to call Frank tonight and explain the situation. If he's interested, he'll drive down from his home in Oregon. It's about a 6-hour drive, so he could be here by tomorrow evening. As General Harrison prepared to leave, Sarah found herself curious about this mysterious engineer who might hold the key to their problem. What kind of person spent 40 years working on helicopters and still found the challenge interesting enough to drive 6 hours for a consultation? The storm had returned, with rain hitting the hangar windows harder than before. Sarah looked at the broken helicopter and wondered if they were about to discover that some problems could only be solved by someone who understood them from the very beginning. Saturday evening brought clear skies and the arrival of Frank Morrison. Sarah watched from the hangar entrance as an old pickup truck pulled into the parking area, its engine making the distinctive rumble of a well-maintained vintage vehicle. The man who stepped out defied her expectations of an 84-year-old retiree, Frank. Morrison stood nearly 6 feet tall with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He moved with the confident stride of someone decades younger, carrying a worn leather tool bag and what appeared to be a collection of original technical manuals. Wrapped in plastic. General Harrison met his father-in-law with a warm handshake and led him toward the hangar. Sarah positioned herself nearby, curious to observe the first meeting between the veteran engineer and the helicopter that had defeated her team. Frank approached the damaged aircraft slowly, walking completely around it twice before saying a word. His eyes moved methodically from component to component, occasionally stopping to examine specific areas of damage more closely. Sarah noticed that he didn't look at their diagnostic reports or computer displays. Instead, he seemed to be conducting his own visual assessment using criteria that weren't immediately obvious. "Well," Frank said finally, "she's been through hell, hasn't she?" General Harrison introduced Sarah to Frank, explaining her role as project leader and summarizing the weeks of repair efforts. Frank listened politely but kept his attention focused on the helicopter. "Captain Mitchell," Frank said, "tell me about the crash sequence. What happened in those final moments before impact?" Sarah consulted her accident report. The helicopter was conducting low-altitude training maneuvers when it experienced sudden power loss. The pilot managed to auto-rotate for approximately 45 seconds before ground impact. The aircraft hit at roughly 60 miles per hour with a nose-down attitude. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Auto-rotation from low altitude. That means the pilot did everything right, but physics still won. The impact pattern tells a story about how the energy was distributed through the airframe during the crash. He approached the twisted rotor hub that had stymied Tom Bradley's team for weeks. Frank pulled a small flashlight from his tool bag and examined the fracture patterns closely, running his fingers along the damaged metal with the familiarity of someone who had touched thousands of similar components. "Your engineers did good work documenting the damage," Frank commented, "but they missed something important. These fractures didn't all happen during the crash. Some of this damage is much older." Sarah moved closer to see what Frank was indicating. To her untrained eye, the metal looked uniformly damaged. But Frank pointed out subtle differences in the fracture surfaces that suggested different types of stress failure. This helicopter had been developing fatigue cracks for months. "Maybe years," Frank explained. "The crash just revealed problems that were already there. Your team has been trying to repair crash damage, but they should have been looking for the underlying structural issues that made the crash so devastating." Dr. Chun joined the group, bringing her tablet with the stress analysis data. Frank examined the computer models with interest, but seemed more focused on the physical evidence visible on the actual aircraft. "Ma'am, Your computer simulations are very sophisticated, Frank told Dr. Chun. But they're based on assumptions about how the metal behaved during the crash. If those assumptions are wrong, your conclusions will be wrong too. Frank opened his collection of technical manuals, revealing documents that Sarah had never seen before. These weren't standard maintenance guides, but original engineering. Specifications and design notes from the helicopter's development period. The thing about the C-47 is that it was over-engineered for durability, Frank explained. The designers in the 1960s didn't have computer modeling, so they built everything stronger than they thought it needed to be. That extra strength is what kept your crew alive during the crash. But it also means the aircraft can survive damage that would destroy a more modern helicopter. Frank spent the next hour examining components throughout the helicopter, comparing the actual damage with specifications in his vintage manuals. He took notes in a small notebook using a mechanical pencil, occasionally making sketches of damaged parts. Sarah watched the process with growing fascination. Frank's approach was completely different from her team's systematic diagnostic procedures. Where they had used advanced testing equipment and computer analysis, he relied on visual inspection and decades of hands-on experience. "Captain, may I see your parts availability reports?" Frank asked. Sarah provided the list that showed which replacement components were available and which were no longer manufactured. Frank studied the documents carefully, occasionally referencing his original technical manuals. Your procurement people did good research, but they were looking for exact replacement parts, Frank said. The original design specifications allow for much more flexibility than modern maintenance procedures suggest. We can substitute components from different aircraft models if we understand the engineering tolerances properly. This revelation surprised Sarah. Military maintenance regulations required exact part matching for safety reasons. The idea of using substitute components seemed to violate fundamental repair protocols. "Sir, wouldn't using non-standard parts create safety concerns?" Frank smiled. "Captain, those safety regulations were written by lawyers, not engineers. They assume that maintenance technicians don't understand the underlying engineering principles. But if you know why a part works the way it does, you can make informed decisions about acceptable alternatives." Frank opened his tool bag and removed instruments that Sarah didn't recognize. Some looked like precision measuring devices, while others appeared to be custom-made tools for specific helicopter components. "These belonged to my team when we were developing the original Chinook design," Frank explained. "We made them ourselves because commercial tools didn't exist for what we were trying to do. Some problems require tools that were designed specifically for solving those problems." As the evening progressed, Frank's assessment began to paint a different picture of the repair project. Where Sarah's team had seen insurmountable problems, Frank identified challenges that could be addressed with creative engineering solutions. "The rotor hub can be repaired," Frank announced, "but not by welding or conventional metal repair. We need to think about this as a complete reconstruction using original manufacturing techniques." Frank explained that the rotor hub had been manufactured using forging processes that created specific metal grain structures for strength. Modern repair techniques tried to patch damaged areas, but Frank proposed rebuilding critical components using the same methods that had created them originally. "The transmission problems are actually simpler than your team thinks," Frank continued. "The stress fractures look dangerous, but they're in non-critical areas. The original design included safety margins that account for this type of damage. We can reinforce the damaged areas and return the transmission to full operational capability." Sarah found herself caught between excitement and skepticism. Frank's confidence was impressive, but he was proposing solutions that contradicted everything her team had concluded after weeks of analysis. "Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, our computer models show that these repairs wouldn't provide adequate safety margins for flight operations." Frank chuckled. "Captain, I helped design this helicopter before computers could model helicopter flight dynamics. We used slide rules and wind tunnel tests and a lot of trial and error. Sometimes the old ways of solving problems work better than the new ways. As they prepared to leave the hangar for the evening, Frank made one more observation that would change everything about their approach to the repair project. You know, Captain, your biggest problem isn't the damaged helicopter. Your biggest problem is that you're trying to repair it using techniques that were never intended for this type of aircraft. Tomorrow, I'm going to show you how to fix a 1960s helicopter using 1960s engineering methods. Sunday morning arrived with Frank Morrison already in the hangar when Sarah's team reported for duty. The elderly engineer had arrived before dawn, armed with coffee and what appeared to be hand-drawn blueprints spread across several tables. He had spent the early hours creating detailed repair plans that looked nothing like the standard procedures her team had been following. "Good morning, Captain," Frank called out cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind that I let myself in." Security was kind enough to provide access after I explained what we're trying to accomplish here. Sarah approached the tables covered with Frank's drawings. The blueprints showed the helicopter from angles and perspectives she had never considered, with detailed cross-sections of internal components and handwritten calculations covering every available margin. "Mr. Morrison, when did you create all of this?" "Oh, I couldn't sleep last night," Frank replied. "Once I understood the extent of the damage, my mind started working on solutions. I've been thinking about helicopters for 60 years, and problems like this don't let me rest until I figure them out." Tom Bradley joined them, examining Frank's blueprints with professional curiosity. "Sir, these repair procedures are completely different from anything in our technical manuals. Are you sure they would work?" Frank pointed to a detailed drawing of the rotor hub reconstruction. "Son, your technical manuals were written by people who never built a helicopter from scratch. These procedures come from the original manufacturing process. We're not just going to repair this aircraft, we're going to rebuild it better than it was before the crash." Dr. Chun arrived with her laptop, ready to input Frank's specifications into the computer modeling software. But Frank waved away the computer with a dismissive gesture. "Ma'am, we won't be needing computer models for this project. The mathematics are simple enough to calculate by hand, and the engineering principles are proven by 60 years of successful flight operations." This departure from standard procedures made Sarah uncomfortable. Military protocols required computer verification of all repair calculations, and she couldn't authorize work that hadn't been digitally modeled and approved by safety officials. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have regulatory requirements that mandate computer analysis of all structural repairs." Frank smiled patiently. "Captain, let me tell you something about those regulations. They were written by people who assume that engineers don't understand the aircraft they're working on. But when you help design the original aircraft, the regulations become less relevant." Frank opened one of his vintage technical manuals to a page covered with original design calculations. The handwritten mathematics showed stress analysis and safety factor computations performed with slide rules and manual calculations. "This is how we calculated safety margins when we designed the CH-47, Frank explained. "No computers, no fancy software, just fundamental engineering principles and careful mathematics. These calculations have been proven correct by millions of flight hours over 6 decades. The morning progressed with Frank leading Sarah's team through his proposed repair procedures. Each step challenged conventional maintenance wisdom, replacing modern techniques with methods that had been developed during the helicopter's original design. Frank's approach to the rotor hub repair was particularly revolutionary. Instead of trying to weld or patch the damaged metal, he proposed completely disassembling the hub and rebuilding it using original forging techniques. "The problem with welding is that it changes the metal's crystalline structure," Frank explained. "But forging creates the grain patterns that give the metal its strength. We can take the damaged components apart, reheat them to forging temperature, and reshape them into their original configuration." Tom Bradley raised practical concerns about this approach. "Sir, we don't have forging equipment in our maintenance facility. And even if we did, the environmental and safety requirements for that kind of metalwork would be enormous. Frank had already anticipated this objection. Son, I know a blacksmith in town who has the equipment and expertise we need. Modern people think blacksmithing is just making horseshoes and decorative ironwork, but the fundamental techniques haven't changed in centuries. Good metalwork is good metalwork, regardless of whether it's done in a factory or a traditional forge. This suggestion pushed Sarah beyond her comfort zone. Military regulations had specific requirements for parts manufacturing, including certified facilities, documented processes, and quality control procedures. Using a local blacksmith seemed to violate every protocol she had been trained to follow. Mr. Morrison, I don't think military procurement allows for custom metalwork by civilian contractors. Captain, military procurement allows for whatever produces safe, effective results. The question isn't who does the work, but whether the work meets engineering specifications. A skilled blacksmith following proper metallurgical procedures can produce components that are superior to mass-manufactured parts. Frank spent the rest of the morning demonstrating his assessment techniques to Sarah's team. His methods relied heavily on visual inspection and physical testing rather than electronic diagnostics. He showed them how to identify stress patterns by examining metal surfaces, how to detect fatigue cracks by feeling for vibration patterns, and how to assess structural integrity using simple tools and experienced judgment. Engineering isn't about fancy equipment, Frank told the group. It's about understanding how materials behave under stress and designing solutions that work within those limitations. The tools are just ways of measuring what you should already understand conceptually. Dr. Chun remained skeptical of Frank's low-tech approach. Mr. Morrison, don't you think computer modeling provides more accurate predictions than manual calculations? Ma'am, computers can only model what they're programmed to understand. But real-world engineering problems often involve variables that computer programs don't account for. Experience and intuition can identify solutions that computer models miss entirely. As the afternoon approached, Frank proposed a demonstration that would prove his assessment methods. He selected a component that Sarah's team had, classified as unrepairable, a damaged section of the main transmission. Housing that showed significant stress fractures. This part looks hopeless. According to your computer analysis, Frank said, but I believe it can be repaired using traditional metalworking techniques. Let me show you. Frank examined the damaged transmission housing carefully, tracing the fracture patterns with his fingers and measuring critical dimensions with calipers. He then outlined a repair procedure that involved heat treatment, careful reshaping, and reinforcement with additional material. The fractures follow the metal's grain structure, Frank explained. If we heat the damaged area to the right temperature and reshape it gradually, we can realign the grain patterns and restore the original strength. It's the same principle blacksmiths have used for centuries to repair broken tools. Sarah realized that Frank was proposing a fundamental change in their entire approach to the repair project. Instead of replacing damaged components with new parts, they would restore original components using traditional manufacturing techniques. Instead of relying on computer models for safety verification, they would use proven engineering principles and hands-on testing. The implications were significant. Frank's approach would require authorization from higher command levels, possibly including exceptions to standard maintenance protocols. It would also require finding skilled craftsmen who could perform traditional metalworking techniques to military specifications, but for the first time since the project began, Sarah felt genuine optimism about the possibility of success. Frank's confidence was backed by detailed knowledge and practical experience that her team couldn't match. His proposed solutions addressed problems that had seemed insurmountable using conventional methods. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said finally, what would you need to make this repair plan work? Frank grinned. Captain, I need 3 things. First, I need permission to use traditional repair methods instead of standard procedures. Second, I need access to skilled craftsmen who can do precision metalwork. And third, I need your team to trust that sometimes the old ways work better than the new ways. As the day ended, Sarah found herself facing a decision that would determine the project's ultimate success or failure. She could continue following established procedures and accept inevitable failure, or she could trust an 84-year-old engineer who promised to accomplish the impossible using methods that hadn't been used in decades. Monday morning brought the most important decision of Sarah's military career. She sat in General Harrison's office, Frank Morrison beside her, presenting a repair plan that would either revolutionize military maintenance procedures or end her career in spectacular failure. The general listened intently as Frank outlined his unconventional approach to restoring the crashed helicopter. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to demonstrate that traditional engineering methods can succeed where modern techniques have failed," Frank concluded. "But I need authorization to work outside standard procurement and safety protocols." General Harrison studied the hand-drawn blueprints spread across his desk. As a career military officer, he understood the risks of deviating from established procedures. But he also recognized that conventional approaches had already failed, and the alternative was scrapping a multi-million-dollar aircraft. "Frank, you're asking me to bet my reputation on repair methods that haven't been used by the military in 40 years. What happens if something goes wrong?" "General, something has already gone wrong. That helicopter is worthless as it sits right now. My approach can either fix it or fail trying, but the current situation is already a failure." The general made his decision. "Captain Mitchell, you have authorization to proceed with Mr. Morrison's repair plan on an experimental basis. But I want daily progress reports, and if safety concerns arise at any point, we shut down the project immediately." Frank's first step was locating the skilled craftsmen needed for traditional metalwork. He had contacts throughout the civilian aviation community, people who still practiced techniques that military contractors had abandoned decades ago. By Tuesday afternoon, he had assembled a team of specialists who understood both traditional metalworking and modern safety requirements. The lead craftsman was Miguel Santos, a 60-year-old master machinist who operated a precision metalworking shop specializing in vintage aircraft restoration. Miguel had learned his trade from old-school artisans who worked before. Computer-controlled equipment dominated manufacturing. "Frank told me about your helicopter problem," Miguel said as he examined the damaged rotor hub. "This kind of damage looks impossible to modern mechanics, but it's exactly the type of challenge we dealt with regularly during wartime. We fixed aircraft using whatever materials and methods were available." Miguel's workshop looked like a museum of industrial equipment. Manual lathes, forges, and precision measuring instruments filled the space, all maintained in perfect working condition despite their age. Sarah watched Miguel examine the damaged helicopter components with the same careful attention Frank had demonstrated. "The fractures in this rotor hub follow predictable patterns," Miguel explained. "The metal failed along its weakest points, but those weak points were created during manufacturing, not during the crash. We can rebuild these components stronger than they were originally." The repair process began with careful disassembly of the damaged rotor assembly. Each component was cataloged and assessed individually, with Frank and Miguel working together to determine which parts could be restored and which needed complete replacement. The work required painstaking attention to detail. Miguel heated damaged metal components in his forge, gradually reshaping them while monitoring temperature and grain structure. Frank provided technical guidance based on his knowledge of the original design specifications. "The key is working within the metal's natural properties," Frank explained to Sarah's team. "Modern repair techniques try to force materials to behave in ways they weren't designed for. Traditional methods work with the materials, using heat and pressure to restore their original characteristics." Dr. Chun remained skeptical of the process, particularly the lack of computer modeling and electronic testing. "How can we be sure these repairs meet safety standards without digital verification?" Miguel demonstrated his testing methods using techniques that predated electronic instruments. He checked metal hardness with manual testing devices, assessed structural integrity through physical stress tests, and verified dimensions using precision measuring instruments. "Ma'am, these testing methods were good enough to build aircraft that won World War II, Miguel said. "The principles haven't changed, even though the equipment has gotten fancier." The rotor hub reconstruction required 2 weeks of intensive work. Miguel and his assistants worked 12-hour days, carefully reshaping each damaged component and testing their progress at every step. Frank provided constant oversight, comparing their work against original design specifications from his vintage technical manuals. Sarah found herself learning entirely new approaches to engineering problem-solving. Frank and Miguel demonstrated techniques she had never encountered in formal engineering education, methods that relied on craftsmen's intuition combined with solid theoretical knowledge. Engineering schools teach students to rely on computer models and standardized procedures, Frank observed. But the best engineers understand materials and forces at an intuitive level. They can feel when something isn't right, even when the computer says everything is perfect. The transmission repair presented different challenges. The stress fractures were extensive, but Frank's analysis showed they were concentrated in non-critical areas, where reinforcement was possible without compromising essential functions. Miguel developed a repair technique that involved carefully grinding out the damaged areas and welding in reinforcement plates using specialized alloys. The work required precise heat control to avoid changing the metal's properties in surrounding areas. Each weld has to be perfect, Miguel explained. Too much heat weakens the surrounding metal. Too little heat creates weak joints. It takes years of experience to develop the feel for exactly the right temperature and timing. Tom Bradley worked closely with Miguel, learning traditional welding techniques that weren't taught in modern technical schools. The process was slower than contemporary methods, but the results showed superior quality and durability. "I've been welding for 20 years, Tom admitted, but Miguel is teaching me techniques I never knew existed. These old methods produce stronger joints than anything I've done with modern equipment." The engine rebuild required the most extensive work. The crash had caused internal damage that seemed beyond repair using conventional methods, but Frank's analysis identified solutions that nobody else had considered. The engine block has stress fractures, but they're in predictable locations, Frank explained. The original designers knew these would be stress concentration points, so they over-engineered those areas. We can repair the damage and actually improve the engine's reliability. Miguel's approach to engine repair involved complete disassembly, inspection of every component, and reconstruction using a combination of original parts and custom-manufactured replacements. Components that couldn't be repaired were recreated using traditional machining techniques. "Modern engines are built for planned obsolescence," Miguel observed. But this engine was designed to be repaired indefinitely. Every component was built to last decades, and most of them can be restored to original specifications with enough skill and patience. As the weeks progressed, Sarah watched the helicopter transform from a twisted wreck into something approaching its original condition. The repairs were taking longer than anyone had anticipated, but the quality of work was extraordinary. Frank's approach had proven that traditional engineering methods could solve problems that stumped modern techniques. But the real test would come when they attempted to start the engines and verify that all systems functioned properly. "Captain," Frank said as they prepared for the first engine test, "we're about to find out if 60 years of engineering experience can bring a dead helicopter back to life. Either we've accomplished something remarkable or we've wasted a lot of time on an impossible dream." The morning of the first engine test brought nervous excitement throughout the hangar. 6 weeks had passed since Frank Morrison arrived with his unconventional repair plans, and now the moment of truth had arrived. Sarah stood beside the restored helicopter. Amazed by the transformation that traditional craftsmanship had accomplished, the aircraft looked almost new. Miguel's metalwork had restored the rotor hub to pristine condition, with no visible signs of the devastating crash damage. The transmission housing showed Frank's reinforcement modifications, which actually appeared stronger than the original design. Even the engine compartment gleamed with the precision of components rebuilt to exceed manufacturing specifications. Frank performed a final inspection, checking connections and alignments with instruments from his vintage tool collection. His methodical approach reminded Sarah of a master craftsman examining his life's work before presenting it to the world. Captain, everything looks exactly as it should, Frank announced. The engine internals have been rebuilt to original tolerances. The transmission has been strengthened at all critical stress points. The rotor systems have been balanced and tested using the same methods we used during original manufacturing. Dr. Chen had reluctantly agreed to participate in the testing process, though she remained concerned about the lack of computer verification. Mr. Morrison, shouldn't we run digital diagnostics before attempting engine start? Frank shook his head. Ma'am, the engine will tell us everything we need to know when we try to start it. If our repairs were successful, it will run smoothly. If we made mistakes, we'll know immediately. Sarah had arranged for a full safety crew to be present during the test. Fire trucks stood ready outside the hangar, and medical personnel waited nearby in case of emergency. General Harrison arrived to witness the test personally, understanding that the project's success or failure would be determined in the next few minutes. Tom Bradley took his position at the engine control panel, ready to shut down systems immediately if problems developed. Miguel stood near the rotor assembly, listening for any unusual sounds that might indicate mechanical issues. Mr. Morrison, Sarah said formally, you have permission to proceed with engine start procedures. Frank smiled and moved to the pilot's position. His hands moved confidently across controls that he had helped design decades earlier. The pre-start checklist proceeded methodically, with Frank explaining each step to the assembled observers. Fuel pressure normal. Hydraulic systems pressurized. Electrical systems showing proper voltage and current. All indicators are exactly where they should be for a healthy aircraft. The moment arrived. Frank engaged the engine start sequence, and the hangar filled with the distinctive whine of turbine engines beginning their acceleration cycle. Sarah held her breath as the sound built to operating pitch, listening for any irregular noises that might indicate problems. The engines reached idle power smoothly, producing the steady roar that characterized a properly functioning CH-47. Frank monitored instrument readings carefully, watching for any signs of stress or malfunction in the rebuilt systems. Engine parameters are perfect, Frank announced over the noise. Oil pressure, temperature, and vibration levels are all within normal operating ranges. The engine is running exactly as it should, but the real test would be engaging the rotor systems. Frank gradually increased engine power while monitoring the transmission and rotor assemblies for any signs of the catastrophic failures that computer models had predicted. The main rotors began turning slowly, building speed as Frank carefully increased power settings. The rebuilt rotor hub performed flawlessly, showing none of the stress indicators that had concerned Dr. Chun's computer simulations. Rotor systems are operating normally, Miguel reported. The rebuilt hub is handling power transmission without any signs of stress or vibration. Everything sounds exactly right? Frank continued increasing power until the helicopter reached full operating specifications. The aircraft that had been declared unrepairable 6 weeks earlier was now running at full capacity, with all systems functioning perfectly. Ladies and gentlemen, Frank announced, this helicopter is ready to return to service. Every component we rebuilt is performing better than original specifications. The success of the engine test vindicated Frank's traditional repair methods. But Sarah knew that the ultimate test would be actual flight operations. Ground testing could verify that systems functioned properly, but only flight testing could confirm that the aircraft was truly safe for operational use. General Harrison approached Frank after the engines were shut down. Frank, I have to admit I was skeptical when you proposed using blacksmith techniques to repair a military helicopter, but the results speak for themselves. How confident are you in the flight worthiness of this aircraft? General, I'm confident enough to fly it myself. The repairs we made didn't just restore the helicopter to its original condition, they actually improved its reliability and durability. This aircraft is safer now than it was before the crash. The next phase would require approval for test flights, beginning with hover tests and progressing to full flight operations. Sarah would need to document the entire repair process for military aviation authorities. demonstrating that traditional methods could meet or exceed modern safety standards. Dr. Chun approached Frank with obvious admiration. "Mr. Morrison, I owe you an apology. Your methods achieved results that our computer models said were impossible. How did you know the repairs would work?" Frank smiled. "Ma'am, I knew they would work because I understood what had failed and why it failed. Once you understand the real problem, the solution becomes obvious. Your computer models were trying to predict the behavior of damaged materials. But we didn't repair the damage, we eliminated it entirely." Miguel began packing his tools, satisfied with the success of his craft work. "Frank, this has been the most interesting project I've worked on in years. It proves that traditional skills still have value in a modern world." Tom Bradley examined the rebuilt components with new appreciation for traditional techniques. "Captain, I learned more about engineering in the past 6 weeks than I did in 4 years of technical school. These traditional methods produce superior results when they're applied by people who really understand them." As the day ended, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned from Frank's unconventional approach. The project had demonstrated that sometimes the best solutions to modern problems could be found in traditional methods that had been forgotten or dismissed. The helicopter that had been declared irreparable was now running perfectly, rebuilt using techniques that were older than most of the engineers who had originally declared it hopeless. Frank Morrison had proven that engineering expertise could transcend technological limitations when it was based on fundamental understanding of materials and forces. But the ultimate validation would come during flight testing. The helicopter that had nearly killed its crew during the crash would soon carry test pilots into the sky, trusting their lives to repairs accomplished using blacksmith tools and 60-year-old engineering knowledge. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said as they prepared to leave the hangar, "when do you think we'll be ready for the first test flight?" Frank looked at the restored helicopter with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished the impossible. "Captain, we'll be ready whenever you are. That helicopter is eager to fly again, and I think it's time to give it that chance." 3 weeks later, Sarah stood on the airfield watching the restored helicopter perform its final test flight. Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Hayes, one of the military's most experienced test pilots, was putting the aircraft through demanding maneuvers that would prove whether Frank Morrison's traditional repair methods had truly accomplished the impossible. The helicopter performed flawlessly, banking left and right, climbing and descending, hovering at various altitudes. Every test demonstrated that the rebuilt aircraft exceeded original performance specifications. Sarah watched through binoculars as the helicopter executed precise maneuvers that would have been impossible with the stress, fractures, and metal fatigue that had originally doomed the repair project. Frank stood beside her, observing the flight with quiet satisfaction. At 84 years old, he had proven that traditional engineering knowledge could solve problems that stumped modern computer-assisted techniques. His hand-drawn blueprints and blacksmith repairs had resurrected an aircraft that 12 skilled engineers had declared beyond salvation. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Frank commented as the helicopter performed a series of aggressive turns that tested the rebuilt rotor systems. "She's flying better now than she probably did when she was new. Miguel's metalwork and our structural improvements have made her stronger than the original design." The flight test was the culmination of 8 weeks of work that had transformed both the helicopter and Sarah's understanding of engineering problem-solving. Frank's traditional methods had not only repaired the aircraft, but had taught her team valuable lessons about the difference between technical knowledge and engineering wisdom. Dr. Chun approached with her tablet, displaying real-time telemetry from the test flight. "All systems are performing within optimal parameters," she reported. "Engine temperatures, rotor stress indicators, and transmission loads are all well within safe operating ranges. I have to admit, your traditional repair methods have produced results that exceed my computer-predicted performance specifications." Tom Bradley joined the group, still amazed by what they had accomplished. Frank, I've been thinking about everything you taught us over the past 2 months. Why don't they teach traditional techniques in engineering schools anymore? Frank considered the question thoughtfully. Son, modern education focuses on using tools and following procedures, but it doesn't teach people to understand the fundamental principles behind those tools. When you understand why something works, you can adapt to situations that the procedures never anticipated. The test pilot's voice crackled over the radio, reporting completion of all flight test protocols. Ground control, this aircraft is performing exceptionally well. All systems are responding normally, and flight characteristics are excellent. I'm ready to return for landing. Sarah watched the helicopter approach for its final landing, reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The project had begun with what seemed like an impossible challenge, repairing an aircraft that was too damaged for conventional techniques. It had ended with a demonstration that traditional engineering wisdom could accomplish what modern methods could not. General Harrison arrived to witness the landing, bringing with him several high-ranking officers who had come to see the results of Frank's unconventional repair project. The success of the helicopter restoration had attracted attention throughout the military aviation community. The helicopter touched down smoothly, its rebuilt landing gear absorbing the impact perfectly. As the engines wound down, Chief Warrant Officer Hayes emerged from the cockpit with obvious enthusiasm. "Sir, that helicopter flies like a dream," she reported to General Harrison. "All control responses are smooth and precise. The rebuilt systems actually feel more solid than most aircraft in our current fleet. Whatever Mr. Morrison did, it worked perfectly." Frank approached the pilot with genuine interest in her assessment. "Ma'am, how did the rotor systems feel during aggressive maneuvers?" "Sir, the rotor response was incredibly smooth. No vibration, no lag in control inputs, and rock-solid stability even during high-stress maneuvers. The rebuilt hub performed better than I expected from a brand-new aircraft." As the post-flight inspection began, Miguel examined his metalwork for any signs of stress or wear. The precision components he had crafted by hand showed no evidence of the catastrophic failures that computer models had predicted. "Everything looks perfect," Miguel announced. "The rotor hub, transmission housing, and engine mounts all show normal wear patterns consistent with a few hours of flight time. Nothing indicates any structural problems or potential failure points." Frank conducted his own inspection using the traditional methods that had guided the entire repair project. His hands moved expertly over rebuilt components, feeling for vibrations and stress indicators that instruments might miss. "Captain Mitchell," Frank said finally, "this helicopter is ready for operational service. The repairs have exceeded every specification we hoped to achieve. Your engineering team now has a working example of how traditional methods can solve modern problems." General Harrison gathered the assembled group for a brief ceremony recognizing the project's success. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've accomplished here represents more than just repairing one helicopter. You've demonstrated that innovation sometimes means rediscovering knowledge we thought was obsolete." Sarah accepted the general's commendation on behalf of her team, but she knew the real credit belonged to Frank Morrison and the traditional craftsmen who had made the impossible repairs possible. "Sir, this project has taught us that engineering education should include traditional methods alongside modern techniques. Frank Morrison's knowledge represents decades of practical experience that can't be replaced by computer programs." Frank smiled at the recognition but seemed more interested in the educational value of the project. "Captain, the most important thing your team learned is that good engineering is about understanding problems deeply enough to find creative solutions. Tools and procedures are just means to an end." As the ceremony concluded and officials departed, Sarah found herself alone with Frank beside the restored helicopter. The aircraft that had been written off as scrap metal 2 months earlier now represented a triumph of traditional engineering over seemingly impossible odds. "Mr. Morrison, I don't know how to thank you for what you've taught us." Frank patted the helicopter's fuselage affectionately. "Captain, the satisfaction of seeing this old bird fly again is thanks enough." Besides, I learned as much from your team as you learned from me. Engineering is always a collaborative effort, regardless of which techniques you use. The helicopter would return to active service the following week, carrying crews who would never know how close their aircraft had come to the scrapyard. Frank's traditional repair methods had not only saved millions of dollars in replacement costs but had created an aircraft that was safer and more reliable than its original configuration. As Frank prepared to return to his retirement in Oregon, he left behind more than just a repaired helicopter. He had demonstrated that engineering wisdom transcended technological change, and that sometimes the best solutions to modern problems could be found in methods that predated computer assistance. The restored helicopter would fly for years to come, carrying Frank Morrison's traditional craftsmanship into missions around the world. And Sarah's engineering team would carry forward the knowledge that true engineering expertise lay not in following procedures, but in understanding the fundamental principles that made those procedures work. Frank Morrison had proven that some problems could only be solved by someone who remembered how they had been solved before computers existed to tell engineers what was possible. The crashed helicopter that experts had declared dead had been brought back to life by the hands and mind of someone who understood that engineering was as much art as science.